How's that? Feels cool and refreshing, right? You were all sweaty anyway, and isn't it nice that the beer smell covers up the sweat? While I'm taking a break from cooking, Bob, all sweaty, splashes beer on me, grinning cheekily. Catherine, what are you up to? Did you spill something again? Hearing the commotion, my mother-in-law comes into the kitchen, blaming me. No! Bob splashed beer on me! To my own surprise, I retort quite loudly. Seeing my reaction, Bob keeps up his cheeky grin and plays innocent. What are you talking about? He wouldn't do that, would he? Even though my mother-in-law seems to know the truth, she defends Bob. The mix of frustration and shock makes me burst into tears right there. What the hell is going on here? Hearing my cry, my father-in-law rushes in. That's enough. You're no son of mine. Get out, now. Chastised by my father-in-law, Bob, overwhelmed, runs out of the house. Not knowing what might happen next. My name is Catherine. I'm a 49-year-old housewife. I live with Bob, my mother-in-law, and my father-in-law. All four of us share the family home. Bob is 55 and works as a salesman. He's apparently a department head at his company, and when he's home, he just can't stop complaining. Mostly to my mother-in-law, about his colleagues and superiors. The way my mother-in-law listens to Bob's rants, she seems to genuinely pity him, always taking his side, no matter how unreasonable his stories are. He has been spoiled like this since childhood, which explains his current self-centeredness. I never realized it until I started living in Bob's family home, but since living with my mother-in-law, I've begun to question Bob's character. Maybe out of jealousy, thinking her precious son was taken away, my mother-in-law began picking on me right after I moved in. Listen, Catherine, you're being allowed to stay at home, so you better make sure you do all the chores perfectly. Always looking down on me, my mother-in-law watches my every move, eagerly pointing out any little mistake. Her favorite phrase to me is, "You must have been so spoiled growing up." Though she herself spoils her son like crazy without realizing the irony. There was a reason my mother-in-law started saying these things to me. This story goes back to when I was a child. I was born the only daughter of a businessman and a stay-at-home mom. Due to our wealthy background, our lifestyle was luxurious. Anything I wanted was bought for me, and I could eat whatever and whenever. Living like this from a young age, I naturally became larger than my peers. Yet, in the midst of all these luxuries, I never cared about my appearance. It wasn't until 7th grade that I became self-conscious about my body. Besides the packed lunch my mom made, I would also bring extra pastries from the convenience store every day. Hey, today you bought 3 pastries, huh? I noticed classmates glancing at me and whispering, giggling. Suddenly, all those things I hadn't cared about became a source of embarrassment. The packed rice box, all the fried food, and the daily pastries. That was when I first realized how abnormal it all was. Although my mom never commented, I was visibly overweight, getting winded even from a short run. One day, I took a hard look at myself in the mirror. The price I paid for being pampered. I overheard some classmates talking that day, and I realized I had probably been made fun of for a long time. I started to reconsider and change my life. Not eating out of mere desire, keeping up with exercise, and helping around the house without relying on my parents. Even though I was just a kid, by sticking to these rules, I took my time and successfully achieved a healthy body and mind. My mom and dad were like, "You don't have to push yourself so hard." But they were moved by my efforts and felt ashamed of their own indulgence. I felt grateful to my parents and started working hard on my own. I focused on my studies and got into a top-tier university, looking forward to my future. However, when it was time to start job hunting, I suddenly wondered what I really wanted to do with my life. With these doubts, I kinda just took the civil service exam and ended up working for the local city hall in Nebraska. After working there for a while, I met Bob, who would become my husband, and we started dating. We dated for about 3 years before getting married. Bob was insistent that I quit my job and become a stay-at-home wife. I wondered, is this what typical happiness looks like? Marrying the person you love and being a housewife? I agreed to quit my job and started living with Bob. However, about 6 months into our marriage, Bob proposed moving to his parents' house. Turned out, his dad was seriously ill and needed care. He said he wanted to be close and take care of his dad, and I couldn't refuse his sincere request. Without giving it much thought, I was touched by Bob's kindness and agreed to move in. But this decision turned out to be a mistake. Living with his mother, Bob became like a completely different person. He prioritized his mother over me and followed whatever she said. They both teamed up and badmouthed me. Before we got married, I had shown Bob some pictures from my childhood as a sort of fun thing. He had complimented me saying I had worked hard to look so good, but now he used those pictures to mock me. He told his mother about my pampered upbringing and they made it into a laughing matter. Given all this, his mother perceived me as a spoiled princess. It's partly my fault for not thinking things through, but once we moved in, taking care of Bob's father became my responsibility. Initially, he was still of working age but became physically ill, making his daily life challenging. His mother didn't want to take care of him and schemed with Bob to have me move in and take on the caregiving role. Unlike Bob and his mother, his father was a gentle soul, always with a smile on his face. He felt bad for me being thrust into a caregiving role at a young age and always tried to make things easier. He noticed the harassment from his wife but felt he couldn't speak up due to his condition. Seeing him like this made me feel really bad for him. While my relationship with Bob worsened, I grew closer to his father. Despite his physical limitations, he was knowledgeable and taught me tips about cooking and cleaning. When Bob and his mother weren't around, he'd even talk about how his wife would try to control things or share funny stories from Bob's childhood. I never realized until I began living in my childhood home, but Bob is what you'd call a mama's boy. According to my father-in-law, John, it's because his wife, Susan, coddled Bob too much when he was little. Even though they've often called me too soft, they don't seem to recognize it in themselves. John was very busy with his work when he was younger, leaving most of the child rearing to Susan. Because of that, he didn't have much time to play with Bob, but he bought him any toy he wanted. I did it out of guilt, but it has led to the way he is now. Having grown up in a similar environment, the story stung, but Bob has lived his life taking such kindness for granted. Susan adored Bob to a fault. When he'd come home with a scratch from school, she'd even barge into the school, yelling. Despite teachers explaining that he just fell and scraped himself, she would relentlessly investigate to confirm if it was truly an accidental scratch. Understandably, with incidents like these, Bob became quite unpopular at school. However, with every toy or game he wanted waiting for him at home, he didn't seem to mind. He believes that if I ever have a problem, Mom will help me out, a mindset that has persisted and contributed to his arrogant attitude today. Though I found many of these stories laughably absurd, living with John has made daily life tolerable. However, since moving into my in-laws' house, the stress and pressure have led me to eat more. I've been gaining weight rapidly, and though I'm not back to my old size, I'm steadily getting there. Both Susan and Bob noticed my change and commented snidely. Even though you're home all day, you're eating too much. If I ever tried to explain myself, Bob would fly into a rage and say, "You should take a lesson from Mom. What stress? What pressure? Don't you dare mention such things in front of my mother. You should be more considerate of her." Whenever Bob felt I was speaking ill of Susan, he would berate me furiously. His constant criticism and harsh words only exacerbated my weight gain. "John, I'm so sorry. With me gaining so much, it must be hard for you to walk through the hallway." Initially, when helping John walk, I would stand beside him. But with my weight gain, I had to assist him from the front in the narrow corridor. "You don't have to worry about that. Thank you for always helping," John would reply, not blaming me at all. However, I indeed felt a sense of urgency regarding my situation. Then one day, as I was preparing dinner as usual, I finished cooking and was in the process of moving the dishes to the dining table. Both Bob and Susan were at home that day, and as usual, neither lifted a finger to help. In my hurry to serve dinner, I tripped and fell, spilling the dishes all over the floor.
Oh no!
With a loud crash, the dish I was holding fell to the floor. I hurriedly tried to gather up the scattered food from the floor.
What on earth are you doing?
Bob exclaimed, more concerned about the messy floor than me.
Oh dear, do you need to start over? Dinner's supposed to be at 6 o'clock.
Susan complained from her seat, not moving an inch.
It's because you've put on so much weight that you trip over nothing. It's embarrassing.
Bob snapped, then stormed off to the living room where Susan was waiting. Fighting back tears, I began cleaning up the mess. The lack of concern from Bob was heart-wrenching. Though I was devastated by their harsh words and attitudes, I didn't want to hear any more from them. Thankfully, no dishes were broken, but I had to redo the meal I had worked hard on.
It happened because I was rushing, not because of my weight.
Unable to voice my feelings, I found myself alone, cleaning up the food that had scattered across the floor. Even though Bob and Susan continued to make snide remarks about dinner being late, once John realized what had happened, he stepped in and thankfully, the situation was diffused. Afterwards, John repeatedly apologized to me, constantly checking if I was hurt or if there was anything he could do to help. John, who always cared for me, had his birthday approaching that weekend. Every year, I make a point to prepare a slightly more lavish dish than usual to celebrate. Whenever I'd ask if he wanted something specific, he'd always say,
"You cook delicious meals for me every day. I can't be so cheeky as to ask for more."
This was a stark contrast to Bob and Susan, who never held back, always wanting cakes from famous bakeries or a fancy steak for their birthdays. Just the thought of having to reserve cakes and meals months in advance for these two gave me an uneasy feeling in my stomach. From our usual conversations, I had picked up on John's favorites and began preparations for his birthday. On the day, I started cooking earlier than usual. It was nearing the end of summer, but with fried dishes on the menu, the kitchen felt like a sauna. To ensure my sweat didn't drip into the dishes, I wrapped a towel around my neck and proceeded with extreme caution.
I wonder if I'm sweating this much because I've gained weight.
With these thoughts, I steadily finished the dishes. I plated the prepared dishes, and all that was left was to wait for my husband's return. Completely drenched in sweat, I felt incredibly uncomfortable. After a short rest, I thought of changing my clothes. As I sat down with a cold iced tea from the fridge, I heard the front door open and realized Bob had come home. Bob walked straight into the kitchen, shot me a glance, and opened the fridge.
"Why are you sweating so much just from cooking?"
Fetching a beer from the fridge, Bob made a sarcastic remark. I tried to ignore the comment, sipping my iced tea, but in the very next moment. Just as Bob opened his can of beer and I thought he was out of my sight, the next moment happened.
Ah!
Suddenly, a cold liquid was poured over me from behind. I could feel the cold fluid running down from my hair and across my upper body. Immediately, I realized from its smell that I had been drenched in beer. As I slowly turned around, there was Bob, holding a can of beer, grinning at me.
"How's that? Feels refreshing, doesn't it?"
Frozen, I just stared at Bob, who continued to smirk.
"At least the smell of your sweat will be replaced by the beer now, huh?"
A few seconds later, Susan rushed into the kitchen after hearing my scream.
"Catherine, what happened? Did you spill something again?"
Desperately, I tried to explain to her.
"No! Bob poured beer over me!"
I raised my voice, louder than I had ever before. Seeing this, Bob, still with that smirk, played dumb.
"Bob wouldn't do such a thing, right?
Susan seemed to realize the truth, but chose to defend Bob.
"What the hell is going on?"
Tears of frustration streaming down my face, I saw John slowly making his way into the kitchen, leaning heavily on his walking stick. Instead of his usual calm demeanor, John's face was contorted with anger. His usually calm face now distorted with anger, John glared at Bob and Susan.
"Bob, did you pour beer on Catherine?"
Confronted by John, Bob responded with a cheeky tone.
"Dad, you don't have to be so mad. It was just a small joke. Enough. I didn't raise you to be like this. Shame on you."
Bob's face paled at the scolding from John, something none of us had ever seen before.
Why are you being so harsh? I was just...
Bob, who had never been scolded by his parents before, was clearly deeply shocked.
You! That's no way to speak.
Immediately, Susan rushes to comfort Bob.
You better knock it off too.
With a sharp rebuke from John, Susan freezes on the spot. From the shock, Bob drops the beer can he was holding and looks like he's about to cry. Seeing Bob like that, I felt truly sorry.
Enough! Enough!
Suddenly, with those words, Bob quickly leaves the kitchen. The next moment, the front door is heard opening and closing swiftly. Seems like he's stormed out of the house.
Bob! What have you done?
Susan shows signs of rushing after him but gives up after a stern look from John.
Just let him be. Leave him alone.
Overwhelmed with shock, Susan leaves the kitchen too. Catherine, I'm truly sorry for all this. Are you hurt? While using his walking stick, John offers me a fresh towel, noticing I'm drenched. I'm sorry. Because of me, both Susan and Bob. For some reason, all that came out of my mouth were words of apology. Seeing me like this, John kindly reassures me and starts cleaning the messy kitchen. Normally, I wouldn't let John, with his physical challenges, do any of this. But this time, I let him take care of it out of gratitude. Neither Susan nor Bob showed up for the rest of the day. After cleaning the kitchen, John and I celebrated a quiet birthday and had dinner together. John repeatedly apologized during dinner and enjoyed the meal I prepared. Though I was concerned about Bob's whereabouts, given what had just transpired, I decided to let him be. The next morning, just a bit past 7 o'clock. Excuse me. An officer brings Bob home, his face swollen and red. Seeing him, Susan looks like she's about to faint. This morning, we found him lying on the grass in a park. From what the officer explained, Bob had been drinking at a nearby park and passed out. When they approached him, his face was so swollen that they immediately called for help. Seems like a severe insect bite. Having spent the night drinking outdoors during the summer, it's no wonder he got bit. Some of the swollen areas look worse than just mosquito bites. I expressed deep gratitude to the officer who had taken care of Bob and welcomed him inside.
Bob! Look at your face! We need to get you to a hospital. And Catherine! This is your fault! What if it doesn't get better?
Bob, still sulking, just stares at Susan as she scolds me.
Seriously, you're always complaining and doing nothing. And all this because Bob just pointed that out a little.
Susan, visibly upset, confronts me with a red face.
Have you two not learned your lesson?
Watching our exchange, John says with a hint of exasperation.
Bob is one thing, but you too, Susan. Pushing all the caretaking on Catherine and then complaining.
John then goes on to express appreciation for my usual efforts. For a while, Bob, with his swollen face, listens to John but eventually bursts out in anger.
That's enough! Dad, you don't understand anything! Yeah, ever since you became like this, everything has been messed up.
Now, Susan joins in, blaming John.
Both of you, stop it! Aren't you ashamed? Do you not realize how sorry and sad John feels for both of you?
Unable to hold back, I raise my voice.
People like you don't have the right to criticize others when you can't even understand such simple things.
As I say this, Bob, losing his temper, charges at me.
Who are you talking to like that?
Bob pushes me, and I fall backward.
Bob!
Seeing this, John lets out a piercing scream. Both Bob and Susan snap back to reality and freeze in place upon witnessing John's anger.
Catherine, can you stand up? Are you okay?
John, showing concern for me, pulled his cell phone out of his jeans pocket. Yes. My son Bob became violent, and someone got hurt. From the conversation, it was clear whom John was calling. After hanging up the phone, John glared at Bob and scolded him even more. Bob, what you did is unforgivable. You need to pay for your actions.
What the? Dad, what are you thinking? Are you out of your mind?
Panicking, Bob clung to Susan, his face on the verge of tears.
Mom! What's gonna happen to me? Help me, do something!
Neither Bob nor Susan could possibly understand how I felt watching Bob's pitiful state. After a while, the police officer who had escorted Bob earlier returned. Facing the pressure of John's account and the officer's presence, both Bob and Susan honestly described what had occurred earlier. Bob, still teary-eyed as he explained, and the officer listening to him was visibly irritated by the aggressor's behavior. The officer, heeding John's insistence, declared that he was gonna take Bob to the police station right then. I couldn't believe the turn of events and was unable to act, but I confided everything to the female officer who was with us. Both Bob and Susan broke down crying, repeatedly apologizing. Fortunately, I only had a minor bump on my head, but it was decided to take me to the hospital just in case. The officer seemed unsure of how to handle a family dispute, but due to John's firm stance, informed us they would treat it as an assault case. Later, after being checked at the hospital and returning, John warmly greeted me.
Were you okay? I'm truly sorry for all that's happened.
Even though it was all Bob's fault, John apologized as if he himself had caused me harm. Susan had gone to the police station to provide a statement, being there with Bob for questioning. While I was at the hospital, John explained what had transpired and continued.
Catherine, I know it's not my place, but you should leave Bob. Being with a man like him will ruin your life. Forget about us and do what's best for you.
I had been contemplating my future for some time, but John's unexpected suggestion took me by surprise.
He might reflect on his actions now, but I won't let him trouble you any further. You gotta live your own life.
Sensing my emotions, John added.
I'm utterly disappointed in Susan. I've decided to move to a retirement community, so I'll be fine.
It seems he has no intention of divorcing Susan, but doesn't want to live with her or Bob any longer. Hearing John's words, years of pent-up feelings overflowed, and I couldn't stop crying for a while. After that, I formally sued Bob. My claim was recognized, and I was granted a divorce and alimony. Furthermore, Bob was found guilty of assaulting me. Susan was shocked by Bob's arrest and the fact that John had left the house. John was thoughtful enough to consider my future and gave me some money for my immediate expenses, separate from the alimony. I thanked John many times for supporting me throughout, and that marked the end of my married life. A few months after divorcing Bob, I rented a new apartment and started working. Having lived with John, I became interested in caregiving. I began studying for the necessary certification and put a lot of effort into job hunting. Then, for my job, I also started eating better and worked hard to lose weight. I might not be back to my old self, but I've managed to get back into shape. Living with John helped a lot, and I quickly adapted to my job. With a lighter body, I moved around more easily and began to go out more on weekends. I was freed from a life where I lived in fear of Susan and Bob, always trying to gauge their moods. I sometimes missed the long years of marriage, but new encounters came my way. I started a cooking class as a hobby and got along with a like-minded man. Though I had traumatic memories from my life with Bob, I'm thinking of getting closer to him gradually. I had such encounters, but I regularly visit John at his care facility. John has always been concerned about me, and he was happy for me when I got a new job and met someone new. John would tell me,
"You can forget about me now."
But he's not like Bob or Susan. I deeply respect John as an individual. He chose to live separately from his beloved wife and imposed strict punishment on his only son, Bob. It must have been a tough decision for him. But he's now living his life positively. Seeing John, I've decided in my heart to live my own life positively from now on.